And two, I can be absolutely incessant with my questions. And trust me, to label my questions as an annoying curiosity would be an understatement. But my intention with these questions is to understand the implication, to understand the smaller bits of information that later snowball into something much larger. And then I came across this quote by the South African bishop Desmond Tutu. He said, "When the missionaries came, they had the Bible and we had the land. We closed our eyes to pray, and when we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land." And the first thought that I had when I read this was of an answer I once got when I asked how India ever came to be colonized. They said they came in as traders, and before we knew it, they were our masters. And to be honest, neither of these answers made any sense to me. How did an invasive event such as colonization go unnoticed? It couldn't have possibly happened in the blink of an eye, as these vagary-filled non-answers made it seem. Fact of the matter is that it hadn't. Colonization is a process of assimilating an entire society under the same flag and tweaking it until it stands for everything that the flag represents. Sounds murky, right? Alright, let's begin by talking about Desmond Tutu himself. This statement makes broad strokes of the process of colonization, but it does take us to the beginning of it. You see, missionaries were one of the first explorers to arrive on the African continent, and eventually they provided the society with several essential services, one of them being education. But these schools followed syllabi in accordance with Western values and ideals, almost unintentionally negating African influence in their own land, almost as if priming the society for the arrival of Western invaders. As a matter of fact, when the Western invaders did arrive, they were unable to conquer nearly 2/3 of African continent, despite the superior weaponry. It was only when they recruited young African men to be led by Western commanders that this conquest was possible. And what exactly made sure of this success? A, the ability of these Western commanders to command and be understood in English. And B, the simple promises of a better life embedded in the minds of these young African men by their own schools. And so, the process of evangelization, possibly unintentionally, sowed the seeds of colonization. And this is not the first time that such mild altering of society has led to significant power imbalances. There are several examples of this in the history of humanity, and I'll give you another one. The Romans barring Greeks from exercising naked in public. As unbelievable as it sounds, the Greeks had a culture surrounding exercising naked in public, which held both religious and symbolic values. You see, during the Olympic Games, the athletes' nakedness was a symbol of the purity and rejuvenation which they dedicated to the Greek god Zeus. Their nakedness was also a symbol of Greek democracy, which dealt everybody the same hand, and hence, by shedding their clothes, each athlete was seen with no social distinction. But by banning this, the Romans managed to snip away at Greek social life, managed to effectively erode a form of worship and tribute while symbolically crushing the ideas of Greek democracy and instilling the idea of Pax Romana. Seems insignificant, right? But a Marxist thinker, an Italian Marxist thinker in fact, Antonio Gramsci, identified this as a phenomenon which he called cultural hegemony. not come to rise as predicted by Karl Marx, he pondered the question why. Of course, it made sense that an oppressive capitalist system which places power in the hands of a select few would face opposition. But it hadn't. And he attributed this to what he called cultural hegemony. He argued that the dominant group had acquired the consent to rule through social institutions such as schools, media, arts, courts, which altered the psyche of the general public to have the oppressive ideals embedded in them. The people truly believe that by living by the rules of the dominant group, they will succeed. And hence, they no longer had reason to challenge authority. Cultural hegemony is not the aggressive takeover of society through force. It is the mild altering and often whitewashing of society until it revolves around those in power. And this happens in things nobody notices. The Greeks must have been disgruntled about the Romans not letting them exercise the way they liked. But it's not something that would have flared them up. They would have just labeled it as arrogance, not realizing that by one true simple act, the Romans managed to chip away at Greek collective identity and thus prevented any question from being raised. Here, I would like to bring in the idea of the Indian sari, which has been worn in the Indian subcontinent for several millennia. Today, if you look it up, you'll find something like this. Meters worth of cloth draped around a woman's body with a complementary top called a blouse to cover her chest. But think of this. Several millennia ago, do you believe that people would have bothered to create two parts of the same cloth so that a woman may cover herself? Several millennia ago, when survival was way harder than it is today, do you believe they would have cared something about this? Fact of the matter is that they haven't. Historically, the sari was 6 yards worth of cloth draped around a woman's body without anything underneath it for the practicality of it. The hem of the sari did not touch the ground because women were active members of the labor force. Their shoulders were barely, if ever, covered to offer some respite from the tropical sun experienced in the Indian subcontinent. But these aspects of an Indian woman's attire must have struck the British as immoral and immodest against what was being worn by women in Britain at that time. And so, lo and behold, came to India the British corset, which has today evolved into the blouse. Again, small change, right? In today's date, the traditional knowledge of draping a sari has been lost. And for better or for worse, even historical representations of native women now include a blouse showing the extent of corruption and manipulation. A factor in the fact that native men were emasculated through art. You see, in artworks such as these, the natives are often shown to be standing in the dark, one person indistinguishable from their next, their bent back symbolizing them bending before power. Even in paintings of Asian courts, the natives are hinted towards being incompetent and incapable through their physique, posture, and clothing. Tell me this. What did this perceived immorality of women and the supposed incompetence of men allow the British to do? By just tweaking arts and fashion, the British men gained a supposed moral right to the exploitation of these women based on their unscrupulous dressing and men's incompetence. And this shows us how an external power can impose itself onto a society in such a covert manner that it distorts reality and completely flips the narrative. And talking about narratives, let's come to my reasons for standing here talking about this today. these and several other instances of mild alterations in society, that several languages, forms of arts, dialects, mannerism have become exterminated, all for the lack of adamance, for the lack of questions, and for the lack of too much adaptability. When we talk about colonization, we look at it through the economic lens. We talk about the loss of gold, we talk about the loss of currency, we talk about the loss of gemstones. But who's going to talk about the hollowing out of an entire society? I refuse to believe that an external power can impose itself onto an entire population by just controlling trade, if not for adaptability. And I do not stand here to argue against adaptation. I do not stand here asking you all to raise your pitchforks at the majority rules. No. Coordination is the basis of a peaceful and thus a successful society, of course. But there's a difference between coordination and complacency. My point here is not to challenge anyone or any institution, but to repeat the idea of identity. As an international student, far too many times I have seen ethnic and cultural identity being unconsciously trampled upon. And I'm compelled to say that there's a difference between bowing in respect and bending over backwards to accommodate. I cannot stand here trying to dictate how we react to every situation. But I can say this. Own your histories, your cultures, your ethnic identities. Talk about your country's histories in terms of national and cultural events, not as pre or post-colonial. Understand your national and cultural and ethnic identities before you nod along to some diluted idea about it. Social homogeneity is important, of course, but cultural hegemony cannot be encouraged.